Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind enemy lines. Not with a regiment, not with a rifle, not with a uniform or a flag, or any of the things you'd normally associate with wartime heroism. Tonight we're going in with nothing but a borrowed identity, a dangerous secret, and the kind of courage that doesn't get statues built in its honor. Tonight we're talking about what it was really like to be a black spy during the Civil War. And before you picture a Hollywood thriller with dramatic music and tight camera angles, understand that the reality was stranger, more terrifying, and more brilliant than anything a screenwriter could invent. Because the most effective spy network in the American Civil War wasn't run by West Point graduates or Pinkerton detectives. It was run by enslaved people. People who were legally classified as property. People who the Confederacy was so certain couldn't think, couldn't plan, couldn't strategize, that they held their most sensitive military conversations in front of them without a second thought. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and whether you've ever kept a secret so well that nobody even suspected you had one. Because the people we're talking about tonight kept secrets that changed the course of a war. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Maybe close your eyes and imagine a world where the most dangerous weapon isn't a cannon. It's a memory. It's a pair of ears. It's the ability to stand in a room full of powerful men and be so thoroughly invisible that they forget you're human. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to spy for the Union while still enslaved in the Confederacy? What did you do when you overheard the general discussing troop movements at dinner and you had to keep serving the roast without your hands trembling? How did you get the information out? Who did you pass it to? What happened if you were caught? Did anyone even believe you when you showed up at Union lines with intelligence that could save thousands of lives? And here's the question that nobody asks enough. How did the most surveilled, most controlled, most dehumanized population in America become the most effective intelligence network the Union had? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, sometime in the spring of 1862. The war is a year old. The city is electric with anxiety and bravado in equal measure. Confederate flags hang from every window. Soldiers crowd the streets, some in crisp grey uniforms and others in homespun that barely qualifies as military dress. Wagons rattle over cobblestones carrying supplies to the front. The smell of horse dung and coal smoke and something else, something metallic and anxious and hard to name that you'll later recognize as the smell of a city at war, hangs in the heavy spring air. And you are an enslaved person, working in the household of a man whose position in the Confederate government gives him access to information that the Union Army would trade a regiment to obtain. You can read, though nobody knows it. You can listen, and everybody assumes you can't understand what you hear. You are the most dangerous person in this city, and not a single soul suspects it. Your day begins before dawn. You lay the fire in the study. You sweep the hallway. You set the breakfast table with the good china, because the master is expecting a visitor this morning. A colonel from the Army of Northern Virginia. You move through the house like water, silent and essential, and the family barely registers your presence. The mistress of the house speaks to you only to issue instructions. The master speaks around you, as though you were a piece of furniture that happened to be in the room, and that is your greatest advantage. That is your weapon. The invisibility that they impose on you is the same invisibility that allows you to operate. colonel arrives at 9. He is tired. His uniform is travel-stained. He accepts coffee from your hands without making eye contact, and he begins to talk. He talks about supply shortages. He talks about the difficulty of moving artillery over Virginia's spring mud. He talks about a planned movement toward the Shenandoah Valley and the number of brigades that will be committed to it. He speaks freely, openly, as though you were not there, because in his mind, you are not there. You are a servant, a fixture, a thing, and things don't listen. But you do listen. You listen to every word. You note the regiment numbers. You note the timeline. You note the anxiety in his voice when he mentions the supply situation, and the confidence when he discusses the planned offensive. And when you leave the room to refill the coffee, service, you carry in your memory a detailed summary of Confederate military planning that would make a professional intelligence officer's mouth water. You have just gathered intelligence of the highest strategic value, and you did it by pouring coffee. Here's the thing about espionage during the Civil War that the standard histories don't emphasize enough. Both sides desperately needed intelligence, and both sides were remarkably bad at getting it through conventional means. The Confederacy had a small, underfunded Secret Service bureau operating out of Richmond. The Union had Alan Pinkerton, whose detective agency was better at catching counterfeiters than gathering military intelligence, and whose estimates of Confederate troop strength were so consistently and dramatically wrong that they led to some of the worst strategic decisions of the war. Neither side had anything resembling a modern intelligence apparatus. There were no satellites, no code-breaking machines, no electronic surveillance. There was just people. People who could cross lines, gather information, and report back without getting killed. And this is where enslaved black Americans entered the picture with a set of advantages that no white spy on either side could match. First, invisibility. The entire social architecture of the South was built on the assumption that black people, and especially enslaved black people, were intellectually incapable of understanding the conversations happening around them. Confederate officers discussed battle plans over dinner, while enslaved servants stood 3 feet away, pouring wine, clearing plates, and absorbing every word. Military dispatches were left on desks in rooms cleaned by enslaved housekeepers. Strategic maps were studied in offices where enslaved workers came and went without challenge. The Confederacy's racial ideology, the very foundation of its existence, was also its greatest intelligence vulnerability. You cannot simultaneously claim that a person is subhuman and then be surprised when that person turns out to be listening. Second, mobility. Enslaved people moved through the southern landscape in ways that white civilians could not. They traveled between plantations carrying messages. They drove supply wagons along military roads. They worked on fortifications and could observe their construction firsthand. They served as boatmen on rivers that were strategic arteries. They worked as cooks, laundresses, and laborers in Confederate military camps. Every one of these roles placed them in proximity to military information, and every one of these roles was considered so beneath the dignity of white Southerners that the people performing them were effectively invisible. Third, motivation. No one in the Civil War had a more direct, more personal, more urgent stake in a Union victory than the 4 million enslaved people in the Confederacy. The outcome of the war would determine whether they and their children and their grandchildren would live in freedom or die in bondage. That kind of motivation produces a level of commitment, courage, and willingness to accept risk that no amount of patriotic sentiment or military pay can replicate. White spies operated for ideology or money. Black spies operated for survival. The difference in commitment was incalculable. The Union military had a term for the intelligence that flowed from these sources. They called it black dispatches. It was, according to analysis published by the Central Intelligence Agency itself, the single most prolific and productive category of intelligence obtained and acted on by Union forces throughout the entire Civil War. Not one of the most productive, more valuable than the reports from white Union sympathizers in the South, more reliable than the information extracted from Confederate prisoners of war, more actionable than the observations of Union cavalry scouts. The intelligence provided by black Americans, many of them still legally enslaved, was the best intelligence the Union had, and it came from people who received no pay, no rank, no recognition, and faced execution if they were caught. Let's talk about how the system worked, because it was far more organized than most people realize. The most basic form of black intelligence was the contraband debriefing. When enslaved people escaped to Union lines, and thousands did as the war progressed, they were classified as contraband of war, a legal fiction invented by Union General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe in 1861 to avoid returning them to their enslaved status. These contraband arrivals were systematically debriefed by Union officers, who quickly discovered that formerly enslaved people possessed an extraordinary amount of militarily useful information. They knew the locations of Confederate fortifications because they had built them. They knew the strength and disposition of Confederate forces because they had cooked for them, driven their supply wagons, and worked in their camps. They knew the terrain because they had lived on it their entire lives, walking roads and crossing rivers that no Union map had ever charted. Allan Pinkerton, for all his failures as an intelligence chief, recognized early that formerly enslaved people were among his most valuable sources. He established a systematic debriefing program for contraband arrivals, and his reports consistently noted that black informants were more willing to cooperate, more detailed in their observations, and more accurate in their reporting than any other category of source. Union generals echoed this assessment throughout the war. Rear Admiral Samuel DuPont, receiving intelligence from Robert Smalls after the latter's dramatic escape from Charleston Harbor, wrote that Smalls was superior to any who have come into our lines, intelligent as many of them have been. The phrase is revealing. DuPont wasn't praising one exceptional individual. He was acknowledging a pattern. The formerly enslaved people arriving in Union lines were, as a group, the best intelligence sources available. But the contraband debriefing was only the most passive form of black intelligence. Beyond it lay a world of active espionage that was far more dangerous, far more deliberate, and far more consequential. Some black Americans operated as agents in place, remaining behind Confederate lines while secretly working for the Union. These were people who continued to live and work within the Confederacy, gathering information through their daily proximity to Confederate military and political leaders, and finding ways to transmit that information to Union forces. The risks were almost incomprehensible. If a white Union spy was caught behind Confederate lines, he might be imprisoned or executed. If a black spy was caught, the punishment was far worse. Returned to enslavement at best, torture and public execution at worst. And there was no prisoner exchange for black operatives, no diplomatic mechanism for their protection, no government that would claim them. Let's talk about the people who did this work, because their stories deserve the kind of attention that history has consistently denied them. Start with Mary Richards, known for much of history as Mary Bowser, though recent scholarship has corrected the name. Her story begins with Elizabeth Van Loo, a wealthy white Richmond woman who was one of the most dedicated Union loyalists in the Confederacy. Van Loo had educated Mary, a formerly enslaved woman from her household, and sent her to school in the North. When the war began, Van Loo hatched an audacious plan. She would place Mary inside the Confederate White House itself, in the household of President Jefferson Davis, as a servant. The plan relied on the same racial assumptions that made all black espionage possible. Mary presented herself as an uneducated domestic, someone so far beneath notice that no one would suspect her of understanding the conversations happening around her. And it worked. She cleaned rooms where Confederate strategy was discussed, running her cloth over the surfaces of desks where maps of troop positions lay open. She served meals where generals reported to the president on the progress of campaigns, standing behind Jefferson Davis's chair with a pitcher of water, while the most sensitive military discussions in the Confederacy unfolded 3 feet from her ears. She moved through the most sensitive spaces in the Confederacy with the freedom that comes from being completely invisible. And she did it day after day, week after week, maintaining her performance with a discipline that would have impressed any intelligence professional in history. Imagine the self-control required. You are standing in a room where the President of the Confederacy is discussing the defense of Richmond. You understand every word. You could recite the conversation verbatim, and your face must show nothing, absolutely nothing. Not interest, not surprise, not the flicker of recognition that crosses a person's face when they hear something significant. Your eyes must remain dull. Your expression must remain blank. Your body language must communicate nothing but the placid servility that these men expect to see. One flash of intelligence in your eyes, one involuntary reaction to a piece of startling news, and you are finished. Van Loo later wrote that the intelligence Mary provided from inside the Confederate White House was the most valuable she received during the entire war. The specifics of what Mary reported remain largely unknown, because Van Loo destroyed most of her records after the war to protect those who had helped her. But the placement itself, an agent inside the enemy's executive mansion, operating under deep cover for years, is one of the most remarkable intelligence operations in American military history. And it was conducted by a black woman who had been born into slavery. Now, let's talk about someone whose espionage was slightly less subtle, but no less extraordinary. Robert Smalls. Smalls was an enslaved man assigned to work aboard the CSS Planter, a Confederate military transport ship operating in Charleston Harbor. By 1862, he had become the ship's de facto pilot, steering it through the harbor's complex network of fortifications, minefields, and checkpoints. He knew the signals the ship used to communicate with harbor sentries. He knew the locations of Confederate mines planted in the waterways. He knew the deployment of every gun emplacement around Charleston. And he had a plan. On the evening of May 12th, 1862, the Planter's 3 white officers made a fateful decision. They left the ship for the night, going ashore either for a party or to visit family, leaving the 8 enslaved crew members on board. It was a decision built on the same assumption that made all black espionage possible. These were enslaved people, property, incapable of independent action. The officers trusted them completely because they didn't consider them capable of betrayal. Captain Relier even left his broad-brimmed straw hat hanging on the bridge, a detail so perfectly symbolic it barely needs commentary. The captain left behind the very prop that Smalls would use to impersonate him. Smalls had been planning this for weeks. He had discussed the escape with every enslaved crew member except one, whom he didn't trust. a detail that reveals the sophisticated operational security instincts of a man who had never received a day of intelligence training, but who understood its principles as naturally as breathing. He had arranged for the crew's families to be waiting at the North Atlantic Wharf on the Cooper River. His wife Hannah knew the plan. She had told Smalls that if they were about to be captured, she wanted him to put her and their children in the water rather than let them be returned to slavery. That is the level of commitment we are talking about. Death before re-enslavement, freedom or the cold, dark bottom of Charleston Harbor. There was no middle ground. There was no third option. There was no plan B. Smalls was ready. In the pre-dawn hours of May 13th, around 3 in the morning, he fired up the ship's boilers, eased the planter away from the wharf at the Southern Wharf, below General Ripley's headquarters, and backed it into the harbor. The night air carried the smell of salt marsh and coal smoke. The harbor was dark except for the distant lights of the fortifications. Smalls steered up the Cooper River to the North Atlantic Wharf, where the families were waiting in the shadows. Without tying up, the ship pulled alongside the wharf just long enough for the women and children to board. 16 people in all, men, women, and children, were now aboard the planter. And then Smalls turned the ship toward the open harbor and the most heavily fortified waterway in the Confederacy. Between him and freedom lay the most heavily fortified harbor in the Confederacy: Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, Battery Wagner, multiple checkpoints where a single suspicious signal would bring the guns of the entire harbor defense system down on them. Guns that could reduce the wooden planter to splinters in a matter of minutes. Smalls put on Captain Relaya's wide-brimmed hat, which the officer had carelessly left behind, and stood at the helm in the darkness, mimicking the captain's posture, his way of standing with his arms folded across his chest. He had practiced the captain's gait and mannerisms for weeks, studying the way Relaya carried himself on the bridge, the casual authority of his bearing. From a distance, in the pre-dawn gloom, with the hat and the posture and the familiar silhouette, he could pass for the white officer. At each checkpoint, Smalls gave the correct signal. The sentries, seeing the familiar silhouette and receiving the expected codes, let the planter pass without challenge. Fort Sumter's guns stayed silent. The ship passed through the last Confederate checkpoint and entered the no-man's water between the harbor defenses and the Union blockade. Think about what those minutes felt like. You are steering a stolen Confederate military vessel through the most heavily defended harbor in the South. Behind you, the entire Confederate garrison of Charleston. Around you, fortifications bristling with cannon that could reduce your ship to splinters with a single broadside. Below deck, your wife, your children, and a dozen other people whose lives depend entirely on the steadiness of your hands and the accuracy of your signals. One wrong note, one hesitation at a checkpoint, one sentry who decides to look too closely, and every person on this ship dies. Not just dies, is captured, returned to slavery, and very probably tortured and executed as an example. You can hear the water against the hull. You can feel the vibration of the engine through the deck plates. And you are wearing a dead man's hat, performing a dead man's gestures, impersonating a white Confederate captain with such conviction that the sentries at Fort Sumter wave you through without a second glance. The passage past Fort Sumter took approximately 30 minutes. 30 minutes during which Smalls and every person aboard the planter existed in a state of terror so complete that some of them later said they couldn't remember breathing. 30 minutes during which The entire escape could have ended in fire and death at any second. 30 minutes that changed the trajectory of every life on board and contributed to changing the trajectory of the war. But Smalls wasn't safe yet. A Union warship, seeing a Confederate vessel approaching in the darkness, leveled its guns and prepared to fire. Smalls had anticipated this. He lowered the Confederate flag, raised a white bedsheet as a flag of surrender, and steamed directly toward the Union ship. In the first light of dawn, the Union crew could see the white flag. They held their fire. It was that close. Seconds. The difference between freedom and obliteration was the time it took for a Union gunner to see a white bedsheet against a grey sky. Smalls delivered to the Union Navy not just a Confederate ship loaded with 4 artillery pieces, 200 rounds of ammunition, and military supplies. He delivered himself. His intimate knowledge of Charleston's harbor defenses, mine placements, signal codes, and fortification layouts was worth more than the ship and all its guns combined. Rear Admiral Dupont immediately recognized the intelligence value of what Smalls brought. The capture of Coles Island, a Confederate position, followed within a week, directly from information Smalls provided. The entire defensive architecture of Charleston Harbor, the single most important Confederate port on the entire Atlantic coast, was compromised in a single night by a 23-year-old enslaved man wearing a borrowed hat and carrying $4 million worth of military intelligence in his head. Smalls went on to pilot Union ships for the rest of the war, participating in roughly 17 military engagements. When the planter's white Union captain hid in the coal bunker during heavy Confederate fire near Folly Island, Smalls took command, navigating the ship to safety under bombardment, becoming effectively the first black captain in the United States military, though he was never formally commissioned. He was promoted and eventually earned $150 a month, making him one of the highest-paid black servicemen in the entire Union military. He used the prize money from the planter's capture to purchase the house of the man who had enslaved him. Think about that. The man whose property Robert Smalls had been now lived in the house that Robert Smalls had bought, with money earned from stealing the Confederacy's own ship. After the war, Smalls served 5 terms in the United States Congress, representing the same district in South Carolina, where he had been born into slavery. But let's step back from the spectacular and look at the ordinary, because the vast majority of black intelligence work during the Civil War wasn't performed by people who stole ships or infiltrated the Confederate White House. It was performed by unnamed, unrecorded individuals whose contributions disappeared from history because neither side kept records of their work, and because the people who did the work had every reason to remain anonymous after the war ended. Think about the cook in a Confederate officer's mess who overheard the discussion of tomorrow's troop movement and found a way to pass the information to a contraband who was heading for Union lines. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't receive a medal. She went back to her fire and her pots and continued to cook meals for men who were fighting to keep her in chains. And she did it with a face so carefully neutral that not one of them ever suspected that the woman ladling their soup was systematically cataloguing their military conversations for transmission to the enemy. Think about the body servant traveling with a Confederate colonel who noted the regiment's strength, its condition, its morale, and its destination, and reported all of it when he reached a Union picket. He rode beside his enslaver for months, carrying his bags, polishing his boots, laying out his uniform, and all the while building a detailed picture of Confederate military operations that he delivered to the Union at the first opportunity. Think about the laundress working in a Confederate camp, who counted uniforms and calculated troop numbers with an accuracy that no distant cavalry scout could match. She handled the clothing of every man in the unit. She knew exactly how many there were, and she could estimate how many were sick or wounded by the condition of the uniforms she washed. That's intelligence data of a specificity that modern military analysts would envy, gathered through the simple act of doing laundry. Think about the enslaved worker building fortifications who could describe their design, their dimensions, their armament, and their weak points to any Union officer willing to listen. He had mixed the mortar, hauled the timbers, and placed the sandbags. He knew the position better than the Confederate engineers who had designed it, because he had built it with his own hands. These people were not trained intelligence operatives. They had no tradecraft, no dead drops, no cipher systems, no handler contacts. What they had was something more valuable. They were embedded in Confederate infrastructure at every level, from the executive mansion to the frontline trenches. And the system that put them there was so thoroughly convinced of their inability to think that it never occurred to anyone to guard information from them. Confederate General Patrick Cleburne recognized the danger, warning his fellow officers about what he called the omnipresent spy system that surrounded them. But Cleburne was a rare voice. The Confederacy's racial ideology was so deeply embedded in its institutional culture that the obvious counterintelligence measure, keeping sensitive information away from enslaved people, was essentially impossible. The entire economy, the entire military logistics system, the entire domestic infrastructure of the South depended on enslaved labor. You couldn't simultaneously use 4 million people to run your civilization and then exclude them from proximity to information. The contradiction was baked into the system, and the Union exploited it ruthlessly. Now let's talk about the most famous black spy of the Civil War, though calling her a spy doesn't begin to capture the scope of what she did. Harriet Tubman. Most people know Tubman as the Moses of the Underground Railroad, the woman who escaped slavery in 1849 and then returned to the South 13 times to lead roughly 70 people to freedom. What most people don't know is that when the Civil War began, Tubman pivoted from civilian rescue operations to military intelligence and combat leadership with a fluency that suggests she had been training for it her entire life. In 1862, at the request of Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, Tubman traveled to the Union-occupied Sea Islands of South Carolina. Officially, she was there to nurse formerly enslaved people who had flooded into Union lines after the Union captured the area early in the war. The Sea Islands had been home to some of the wealthiest rice and cotton plantations in the South, and when the planters fled the Union advance, they left behind roughly 10,000 enslaved people who suddenly found themselves in a strange liminal space, no longer enslaved, not yet free, living in the ruins of the plantations that had been their prisons. Tubman nursed them, taught them, and listened to them. And quietly, systematically, she began building a spy network. Tubman recruited 8 or 9 scouts, all black men with intimate knowledge of the local terrain, rivers, and communities. These were men who had grown up on these rivers, who knew every creek and inlet and tidal flat, who could navigate the twisting marshes and blackwater waterways of the South Carolina low country in total darkness without a compass or a map. She sent them behind Confederate lines to gather intelligence on troop positions, supply depots, and the locations of torpedoes, the underwater mines that the Confederacy had planted in South Carolina's coastal rivers to prevent exactly the kind of operation Tubman was planning. She also debriefed every contraband who arrived in Union lines, extracting information with a skill that Union officers noted with open admiration. Lieutenant George Garrison, son of the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, wrote home that Tubman made it a business to see all contrabands escaping from the rebels and is enabled to get more intelligence from them than anyone else. Major General David Hunter, the Union commander of the Department of the South, issued Tubman a military pass that read, "Give her free passage at all times, on all government transports. Harriet is a valuable woman." That single sentence on an official military document tells you everything about how the Union military regarded her intelligence work. She was valuable, she was trusted, and she had the kind of access that no other civilian, black or white, male or female, enjoyed in the Department of the South. The reason was simple and profound. Enslaved people trusted Tubman in a way they would never trust a white Union officer. She looked like them. She had lived their experience. She had been enslaved herself and had broken free. She bore the scars of slavery on her body, including the traumatic brain injury that caused her narcoleptic episodes. She spoke their language of suffering and endurance, though she needed help with the specific Gullah dialect of the Sea Islands. And she had a track record of delivering on her promises that no white officer could match. When Tubman said she could get you to freedom, you believed her, because she had done it before, 13 times on the Underground Railroad, and had never lost a single passenger. Not one. That record was her credential, and it was worth more than any military commission. The intelligence Tubman gathered culminated in one of the most extraordinary military operations of the Civil War. On the night of June 1st, 1863, 3 Union gunboats departed Beaufort, South Carolina, heading up the Combahee River. Aboard the lead ship, the John Adams, were Colonel James Montgomery, 300 black soldiers of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, and Harriet Tubman, with her ring of scouts and pilots. Let's slow this down, because the planning that went into this operation deserves the same attention we give to the operation itself. Tubman didn't just wake up one morning and decide to lead a military raid. She spent months building the intelligence picture that made it possible. She sent her scouts, all black men, who could move through the countryside without arousing suspicion, deep into Confederate territory along the Combahee River. They identified the locations of Confederate picket posts. They mapped the roads leading to and from the river. They located the rice plantations where enslaved people were concentrated. And most critically, they found the men who had been forced to plant torpedoes in the river. The torpedo intelligence was the key to the entire operation. The Confederacy had mined the Combahee River precisely to prevent the kind of raid Tubman was planning. Without knowing the locations of those mines, the Union gunboats would have been destroyed before they reached their first objective. Tubman's scouts located the enslaved men who had placed the torpedoes and promised them freedom in exchange for the mines' positions. The men agreed. And just like that, the Confederacy's most important river defense was compromised by the same people who had been forced to install it. Tubman also organized the reception on the other end. Through her network, word was spread to enslaved people along the river that liberation was coming. They were told to be ready. When the gunboats arrived, they would have minutes, not hours, to get to the shore and board. Anyone who hesitated might be left behind. The communication chain required absolute trust at every link, because a single informant alerting the Confederates would have turned the raid into a massacre. The gunboats navigated the mine-filled river without incident, guided by Tubman's intelligence. Around 2:30 in the morning on June 2nd, the ships reached their first objective. Union troops disembarked at Fields Point, driving off surprise Confederate pickets, who barely had time to grab their weapons before fleeing into the woods, leaving their blankets still warm. The gunboats continued upriver, landing more troops at Tar Bluff, and then pushed on toward the rice plantations. What happened next was one of the most remarkable scenes of the entire war. Confederate soldiers and overseers fled in confusion, and then the enslaved people came. They streamed out of the fields and down to the riverbanks, hundreds of them, men, women, and children, running toward the gunboats with whatever they could carry. Some had bundles of clothing, some carried cooking pots, some had nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had been waiting for this moment, some of them for hours, some of them for their entire lives. The scene was chaotic. The riverbanks were steep and muddy. People waded into the water chest deep, holding children above their heads. Rowboats from the gunboats shuttled back and forth, filling and returning. Confederate troops were beginning to organize a response. Gunfire crackled in the distance, and in the middle of it, all Tubman, standing on the deck of the John Adams, 5 feet tall and absolutely commanding, began to sing. She sang an abolitionist song, and her voice carried across the water to the panicking crowd, and the sound of it, the sound of a black woman singing freedom songs from the deck of a Union warship, calmed people enough that the boarding could continue. When the gunboats turned back toward Beaufort that afternoon, they carried more than 750 formerly enslaved people. Confederate soldiers who arrived too late to stop the raid found their plantations in ruins, the rice crops burning, the mills and warehouses destroyed, a pontoon bridge shot to pieces by the gunboat's cannon. The damage was estimated at $6 million. Not a single Union soldier had been lost. Not one. At least 100 of the freed men enlisted in the Union Army within days. A reporter from the Wisconsin State Journal heard about the raid and wrote a story without a byline about the She-Moses, who had guided a gallant band of black soldiers into the enemy's country, where they had struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton and lordly dwellings, and striking terror to the heart of rebeldom. Brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property without losing a man or receiving a scratch. The reporter never mentioned Tubman by name. A month later, a Boston newspaper editor who knew Tubman personally identified her as the heroine of the Combahee River raid, thus publicly revealing her work as a spy and military leader. Harriet Tubman had just become the first woman in American history to plan and lead an armed military raid. She was paid nothing for it. She received no rank, no medal, and no pension for decades. When she eventually applied for a military pension, she learned that she had never been officially commissioned, despite years of service as a spy, scout, nurse, and military leader. In 1899, after decades of applications and appeals, Congress granted her a pension of $20 a month, later reduced from the amount she had originally requested. The first woman to lead an American military operation was compensated with less than most privates received. Let's step back now and talk about something that connects all of these stories: the act of performing ignorance. If you were a black spy in the Civil War, your survival depended on your ability to perform a version of yourself that the white people around you expected to see. You had to appear dull when you were sharp, passive when you were calculating, obedient when you were defiant, illiterate when you could read every document on the general's desk. The performance was constant, exhausting, and existentially terrifying, because a single slip, a flash of intelligence in your eyes at the wrong moment, a question that revealed too much understanding, could expose you and cost you your life. Mary, Richards performed the role of a dim-witted servant in Jefferson Davis's household while memorizing the details of Confederate strategy discussions. Robert Smalls performed the role of a contented, trustworthy enslaved pilot while planning the most audacious escape of the war. Tubman, when operating behind Confederate lines, disguised herself as an elderly, stooped woman, using her ability to transform her appearance and bearing to move through hostile territory undetected. An activist who worked with her after the war wrote that Tubman could banish all expression from her features and look so stupid that nobody would suspect her of knowing enough to be dangerous. But her eye flashes with intelligence and power when she is roused. This performance had a name in the black community, though it took many forms. The mask, the face you showed the world, was not the face you wore in private. The self you performed for white consumption was not the self that existed when the performance ended. It was a survival strategy as old as slavery itself, refined over centuries of living under surveillance, and it turned out to be the perfect foundation for espionage. Every enslaved person in the South had been practicing the essential skills of a spy since childhood: observation, dissimulation, information management, and the ability to maintain a cover identity under extreme pressure. The Confederacy didn't just fail to guard against black espionage. It actively trained its future spies by creating the conditions in which these skills were necessary for survival. Now let's talk about the information pipeline, because gathering intelligence was only half the challenge. The other half was getting it to the people who could use it. And this is where the ingenuity of the Black Intelligence Network becomes most vividly apparent. The methods were as varied as the circumstances, and they drew on centuries of covert communication practice within enslaved communities. Some intelligence was carried physically by contrabands crossing Union lines, memorized because writing anything down was too dangerous, or hidden on their persons in ways that would survive a casual search. A man walking to Union lines might carry nothing suspicious, but the information stored in his memory, precise counts of artillery pieces, overheard conversations about troop movements, descriptions of fortification layouts, was worth more than any document a cavalry scout could have produced. Some intelligence was transmitted through the grapevine, the informal communication network that enslaved communities had maintained for generations. The same system that had carried news of sales, escapes, births, deaths, and uprisings for centuries now carried military intelligence with equal speed and remarkable reliability. Information could move from a plantation deep in Confederate territory to Union lines in a matter of days, passed from person to person through a chain of trust forged over generations of shared experience. A cook on one plantation tells a visiting preacher. The preacher tells a deacon at the next church. The deacon tells a boatman who is heading downriver. The boatman tells a fisherman who works near the Union picket line. The fisherman tells a Union sailor. By the time the information reaches the intelligence officer's desk, it has traveled 50 miles through 5 pairs of hands, and not a single link in the chain has been visible to Confederate surveillance. Enslaved boatmen on rivers could pass information to Union naval pickets during what appeared to be routine fishing trips. A man paddling a canoe past a Union gunboat might exchange a few words with a sailor, and in those words might be the location of a Confederate battery or the movement of a regiment 20 miles inland. The exchange was invisible to anyone watching from shore. It looked like nothing. A slave out fishing, a bored sailor on watch, a brief wave as the canoe drifted past. Nothing to see, nothing to report. And yet, information had just changed hands that could alter the course of a battle. enslaved workers near the front lines could slip away to Union positions under cover of darkness, deliver their intelligence, and return before dawn. The distance might be short, a few hundred yards in some cases, but the danger per foot was extreme. Confederate pickets patrolled the space between the lines, and a black person caught moving toward Union positions at night would be presumed a spy and treated accordingly. Free black people in border cities served as crucial intermediaries. A free black market woman might travel between a Confederate-held town and a Union-occupied area, carrying produce to sell and intelligence to deliver. Her movement between the two zones was routine, expected, and unquestioned. She was, as far as anyone was concerned, simply a vendor trying to make a living in wartime. The intelligence she carried in a hollowed-out vegetable or a false-bottomed basket was invisible. In Richmond, Elizabeth Van Loo operated a network that included multiple black agents and used a variety of methods to move information out of the Confederate capital. Messages were hidden in the soles of servants' shoes, inserted between the layers of leather where no inspection would find them. They were concealed in baskets of produce carried to market, tucked among the eggs or buried under vegetables. They were written in invisible ink on seemingly innocuous letters that appeared to discuss nothing more sensitive than the weather or the health of relatives. Van Loo even maintained a series of safe houses and relay points between Richmond and Union lines, creating a physical infrastructure for the transmission of intelligence that operated continuously throughout the war. The network was so effective that it supplied intelligence directly to Union General Ulysses Grant during the siege of Petersburg, contributing to the strategic decisions that would eventually force Lee's surrender at Appomattox. One method that deserves special mention is the use of clothing as a transmission medium. Messages were sewn into the hems of dresses, hidden in the lining of jackets, concealed in the seams of trousers. A servant delivering laundry between houses might carry intelligence literally woven into the fabric. A woman passing through a checkpoint might be wearing her intelligence, her dress carrying more secrets in its seams than any document in any general's office. The method was nearly undetectable because no one searched the clothing of enslaved people with the thoroughness that would have been required to find a message hidden in a hem. The ingenuity of these transmission methods reflected the ingenuity of the people who devised them. These weren't systems designed in a military academy. They were improvised by people who had spent their lives finding ways to communicate covertly within a system designed to prevent it. The same skills that had allowed enslaved communities to maintain hidden lines of communication through spirituals, coded language, and secret meetings now served the Union war effort. The Confederacy had spent 2.5 centuries building a surveillance state to control its enslaved population, and the enslaved population had spent 2.5 centuries learning to communicate beneath that surveillance. The war simply provided a new and ultimately decisive application for those skills. Let's talk about another spy whose story deserves more attention than it gets. Abraham Galloway. Galloway was born enslaved in North Carolina in 1837 in a small fishing village on the Cape Fear River. He worked as a brick mason, a skilled trade that gave him both physical strength and an understanding of construction that would later prove useful. At 19, he made his escape by hiding in the hold of a ship, carrying barrels of turpentine, tar, and rosin, crammed into a space that would have been suffocating even without the chemical fumes of the cargo around him. He made his way to Philadelphia, then to Canada, and then to Haiti, where he joined revolutionaries planning an attack on the American South that never materialized. By the time the Civil War began, Galloway had transformed from an escaped slave into a seasoned revolutionary with connections across the abolitionist movement. Union leaders in the North were searching for Black Americans whom they could recruit as spies. The problem was simple. The Union Army was about to send hundreds of thousands of young men into a region they didn't know, against an enemy they didn't understand, and they had almost no intelligence gathering capacity in the South. They needed people who knew the terrain, who understood the social dynamics, who could move through Confederate territory without arousing suspicion. They needed Black operatives, and Galloway, with his reputation for cunning, courage, and an absolute refusal to defer to anyone regardless of their rank or skin color, was exactly who they needed. He returned to the South and established a spy network that operated in the coastal regions of North Carolina, gathering and transmitting military intelligence to Union forces. His network included formerly enslaved people, free Black Americans, and sympathetic whites, all coordinated by a man who was, by every account, as charismatic as he was fearless. Historian David Sokolsky, who spent years recovering Galloway's story, describes him as a swashbuckling figure who wouldn't take sass from Northern or Southern or Black or white, Union or Confederate. The details of Galloway's spy operations are largely lost to history, destroyed by the same forces that eliminated most records of Black espionage. But fragments survive. He operated behind enemy lines in territory where a Black man caught aiding the Union would have been executed on the spot or sold back into slavery. He established communication networks that moved intelligence across Confederate lines to Union handlers. He recruited and managed agents, maintained operational security, and produced intelligence that was valued by Union commanders. But Galloway wasn't content to merely spy. He was also one of the most effective recruiters of Black soldiers for the Union Army, a task that required him to move between Confederate and Union territory, persuading enslaved and free Black men to risk everything for a cause that, in the early years of the war, hadn't even explicitly committed to their freedom. He recruited thousands of Black soldiers, a contribution that was both military and moral, helping to build the fighting force that would eventually include nearly 200,000 Black men. And when Union forces failed to live up to their promises to the Black people who aided them, Galloway pushed back with a ferocity that startled white officers. When Union troops recruited Black laborers with promises of protection and then used them as expendable labor on dangerous fortification projects, abandoning them to Confederate retribution when they withdrew, Galloway confronted the Union generals directly. He demanded better treatment. He insisted that the Black men risking their lives for the Union cause deserved the same protections as white soldiers. In one famous encounter, he reportedly arrived at a meeting with Union officers carrying concealed weapons, making it clear that his patience for broken promises had limits. After the war, Galloway was elected to the North Carolina State Senate, one of the first Black Americans to hold such office. He fought for Black suffrage, Black education, and Black civil rights during the brief window of Reconstruction. He died in 1870, at the age of 33, worn down by years of dangerous work and the relentless stress of operating in hostile environments. His story was buried for more than a century before Sokolsky's research brought it back to light, a reminder that the recovery of Black history is an ongoing project with no guarantee of completion. Let's talk about Mary Lou Vestre, whose story is brief but extraordinary. Lou Vestre was a free Black woman working as a seamstress at the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia. Her position gave her proximity to the engineers and mechanics working on one of the most sensitive military projects in the Confederacy. the conversion of the salvaged hull of the USS Merrimack into the CSS Virginia, an ironclad warship that the Confederacy hoped would break the Union naval blockade and revolutionize naval warfare. In 1862, Louveste obtained documents revealing the details of the ironclad's construction. The exact mechanism by which she acquired these papers is unclear. The records are fragmentary, but the result is not. She had in her possession plans that described a weapon system the Union had no effective counter for, and she understood their significance. Louveste crossed Confederate lines on foot. Think about what that means. A free black woman, carrying stolen military documents, walking through territory patrolled by Confederate soldiers who would have arrested, interrogated, and quite possibly executed her if they had discovered what she carried. Every step was a risk. Every checkpoint was a potential death sentence, and she kept walking, mile after mile, through hostile country, carrying information that could change the war. When she arrived in Washington, D.C., and tried to deliver the intelligence to Union naval officials, they hesitated to meet with her. A black woman showing up at the Navy Department with claims about a Confederate superweapon was not, apparently, what the bureaucracy was prepared to handle. So she went back, and went back again. She refused to be dismissed. She insisted until they listened, until someone with enough authority and enough sense to take her seriously actually looked at what she had brought. The information Louveste provided helped accelerate the Union's construction of its own ironclad, the USS Monitor, which would meet the CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads in March 1862. The engagement, the first battle between ironclad warships in history, ended in a tactical draw but a strategic victory for the Union, as the Virginia failed to break the blockade. Whether Louveste's intelligence was the decisive factor in the Monitor's timely completion is debated by historians. What is not debated is that a free black woman, walking across enemy territory with stolen documents, too stubborn and too brave to accept rejection, contributed to one of the most consequential naval engagements of the war. Now let's talk about what happened after the war, because the story of black espionage in the Civil War has a coda that is as revealing as the story itself. The intelligence contributions of black Americans began to disappear from history almost immediately. The reasons were multiple and compounding. First, secrecy. Successful spies, by definition, don't want to be identified. Many of the black Americans who had provided intelligence to the Union lived, after the war, in communities where former Confederates still held power and still harbored violent resentment. Identifying yourself as a Union spy in the post-war South was an invitation to retaliation. The Ku Klux Klan and similar white supremacist organizations were terrorizing black communities throughout the former Confederacy. A formerly enslaved person who was known to have spied for the Union would have been a particular target. Anonymity wasn't a preference. It was a survival strategy that continued long after the shooting stopped. Second, record destruction. Before fleeing Richmond in April 1865, the Confederate Secretary of War ordered the destruction of virtually all intelligence files, including counterintelligence records about Union spies. The bonfires that consumed the Confederate archives also consumed the only official record of many black espionage operations. On the Union side, many intelligence records were given to individual participants or simply allowed to deteriorate. Van Loo destroyed much of her correspondence to protect her network. Pinkerton's records were scattered after the war. The documentary evidence that would have supported the contributions of black spies was systematically eliminated or allowed to decay. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, racism. The post-war narrative of the Civil War was shaped by white voices on both sides who had little interest in acknowledging the intelligence contributions of Black Americans. The Confederacy's lost cause mythology, which recast the war as a noble defense of states' rights rather than a fight to preserve slavery, certainly had no room for the idea that enslaved people had outsmarted their masters. But even the Union narrative tended to minimize Black contributions, preferring stories of white heroism and white strategic genius. The idea that the most effective intelligence network of the war had been operated by enslaved people challenged assumptions about racial capability that even many Northern whites weren't prepared to abandon. 24 books were published after the war by self-proclaimed spies and counter-spies. 17 from the Union side, 7 from the Confederate side. Not a single one was written by a Black American. The stories of Black espionage that did survive came through white intermediaries, usually the white handlers or allies who had worked with Black agents. Van Loo's accounts of Mary Richards, Pinkerton's mentions of John Scobell, newspaper stories about Smalls and Tubman. These second-hand accounts were better than nothing, but they were filtered through white perspectives and white priorities, and they inevitably centered the white participants in stories where the Black agents had been the principals. The result is a gap in the historical record that scholars are still working to fill. For every Mary Richards, Robert Smalls, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Galloway, and Mary Lou Vester, whose name has been recovered, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of unnamed individuals whose intelligence contributions were essential to the Union victory and whose stories are permanently lost. The cook who overheard the battle plan, the body servant who counted the artillery pieces, the laundress who reported the regiment's destination, the boatman who mapped the minefield, the contraband who walked 50 miles to Union lines with information that saved a brigade. Their work mattered. Their courage was extraordinary. And the record of what they did was erased by the same racial attitudes that made their espionage possible in the first place. It wasn't until the 20th century, and particularly the late 20th century, that historians began to seriously investigate Black contributions to Civil War intelligence. The CIA published its landmark study, Black Dispatches, Black American, Contributions to Union Intelligence During the Civil War, which documented 9 Black Americans whose intelligence work could be verified through surviving records, and acknowledged that these 9 represented only the tip of an enormous iceberg. Academic historians like David Sikelski, who recovered Abraham Galloway's story, and Elizabeth Varron, who documented the full scope of Van Loo's Richmond network, have deepened our understanding of Black espionage, but much of the record is gone forever, destroyed by Confederate bonfires, lost to Union carelessness, and buried by a century of racial prejudice. Let's sit with that irony for a moment. The thing that made Black spies so effective, the Confederacy's belief that Black people were incapable of sophisticated thought, is the same thing that caused their contributions to be erased from history. The assumption of Black incompetence was both the tool that enabled the espionage and the tool that buried the record of it. The Confederacy couldn't see the spies because it couldn't see the people, and post-war America couldn't honor the spies because it, too, struggled to see the people. There's a deeper irony, too, one that extends beyond the war itself. The skills that made Black Americans such effective spies, the ability to observe without being noticed, to operate under constant surveillance, to maintain a double identity, to communicate covertly, to manage information under extreme pressure, were skills that had been forged by slavery itself. The system that sought to dehumanize them had instead equipped them with a toolkit of survival strategies that, when turned to espionage, proved devastatingly effective. Slavery was intended to produce compliant, unthinking labor. Instead, it produced the most capable intelligence operatives in the theater of war. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed in the context of Civil War espionage: the emotional cost. Imagine living in the Confederate White House, cleaning rooms and serving meals, while carrying in your memory the details of conversations that could change the course of the war. You can never relax. You can never drop the performance. You are surrounded by people who, if they discovered what you were doing, would have you publicly tortured and executed as an example. Every day is an exercise in controlled terror, a test of your ability to maintain composure while your heart is pounding and your mind is racing and the stakes are literally life and death. And you can't talk about it. You can't process the stress with a friend, because involving anyone else increases the risk of exposure. You can't confide in a family member, because the less they know, the safer they are. You carry the burden alone, day after day, week after week, month after month, performing normalcy while secretly conducting one of the most dangerous activities a human being can undertake. The psychological toll is almost unimaginable. Think about the specific moments that must have tested the nerves of every black spy. The moment when a Confederate officer looks at you a beat too long, and you don't know if it's suspicion or just the casual scrutiny of a man sizing up a servant. The moment when someone mentions that a spy has been caught in another city, and the room goes quiet, and you feel every eye on you, even though no one is looking your way at all. The moment when your contact fails to appear at the arranged meeting point, and you don't know if they've been caught or simply delayed, and you have to decide whether to wait or flee. The moment when a child's cry threatens to reveal a hidden meeting, or a dog begins to bark as you approach a dead drop, or a neighbor gives you a look that suggests they know more than they should. Each of these moments is a test of self-control that would challenge a trained professional. And you are not a trained professional. You are an enslaved person with no training, no support system, no exfiltration plan, and no guarantee that your sacrifice will ever be acknowledged. You are operating on courage alone, and it is enough. Somehow, incredibly, it is enough. The physical toll was real too. Tubman suffered from narcoleptic episodes throughout her life, the result of a traumatic brain injury inflicted by a slaveholder during her childhood. These episodes caused her to lose consciousness without warning, sometimes for minutes at a time. She experienced them during her Underground Railroad operations and continued to experience them during her military service. Imagine leading a spy network, planning a military raid, and navigating a mined river while living with a neurological condition that could incapacitate you at any moment. The danger of discovery was compounded by the danger of her own body betraying her. And still she served, for years, without complaint and without compensation. Smalls carried the memory of the night he stole the planter for the rest of his life. In the decades after the war, he sought recognition and compensation from a government that was alternately grateful and indifferent. Congress debated for years whether to award him the full value of the ship he had captured, eventually granting him a fraction of what he deserved. The emotional labor of having to petition the government of a country he had helped save, arguing his case before lawmakers who sometimes questioned whether a black man could have done what Smalls had so obviously done, was its own form of psychological toll. Mary Richards, after the war, struggled financially. The woman who had spied inside the Confederate White House, whose intelligence Van Loo called the most valuable she received during the entire war, could not find steady employment in freedom. She lived in poverty. She wrote about the racism she encountered in both the North and the South. The reward for her extraordinary service was a life of hardship that made the bondage she had risked everything to help end seem, in some ways, to have been merely replaced by a different kind of confinement. These are the costs that don't appear in the intelligence reports: the broken health, the unacknowledged sacrifice, the post-war poverty, the struggle for recognition in a country that owed its preservation, in part, to the very people it continued to marginalize. The story of black spies in the Civil War is not a story that ends with victory. It is a story that continues through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the long century of segregation and disenfranchisement, during which the contributions of black Americans to the Union cause were systematically erased from the national narrative. Modern intelligence agencies recognize the immense stress that undercover operations place on their agents and provide support systems, psychological counseling, handlers who maintain regular contact, extraction plans for emergencies. Black spies in the Civil War had none of this. They had their own courage, their own faith, their own community, and the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. That was the entire support system, and it was enough somehow for people like Mary Richards and Robert Smalls and Harriet Tubman and Abraham Galloway and Mary Lou Vester and John Scoble and George Scott and hundreds of others whose names we will never know to continue day after day in conditions that would break most people. Let's go back to the field, because there's a dimension of black intelligence work that doesn't get the attention it deserves. The enslaved workers who built Confederate fortifications. Throughout the war, the Confederacy conscripted enslaved labor for military construction on a massive scale. Enslaved people built the earthworks, trenches, gun emplacements, and defensive positions that formed the backbone of Confederate military strategy. They dug ditches, hauled lumber, mixed mortar, and moved earth by the ton, often under fire, always under the whip, building the very structures that their labor would then be used to defend. But here's the thing the Confederacy apparently never considered. The people building the fortifications knew everything about them. They knew the dimensions. They knew the placement of the guns. They knew where the walls were thickest and where they were thinnest. They knew the blind spots, the vulnerable angles, the points where an assault might succeed. And when they escaped to Union lines, or when Union forces captured the territory, they brought this knowledge with them. One of the first major battles of the Civil War was fought on intelligence provided by George Scott, an escaped slave who furnished detailed information on Confederate fortifications and troop movements to General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe. Scott's intelligence contributed directly to the engagement at Big Bethel, one of the earliest large-scale battles of the war. He wasn't a spy in the dramatic cloak and dagger sense. He was a man who had been forced to build the enemy's defenses and who then told the other side exactly how to attack them. The Confederacy had handed him the intelligence by forcing him to do the construction. The irony is so dense, you could build a fortification out of it. Let's pause here and really unpack what George Scott did, because it illustrates how the entire black dispatches system operated at the ground level. Scott had been enslaved on a property near the Confederate position at Big Bethel. He had been conscripted, like thousands of other enslaved men, to dig trenches and construct earthworks for the Confederate defense. While digging, he observed everything: the number of soldiers, the placement of artillery, the approaches to the position, the supply lines, the terrain. When he escaped to Union lines at Fort Monroe, he reported all of it to General Butler, who used the intelligence to plan an assault. The assault itself, on June 10, 1861, was actually a Union defeat, largely due to poor coordination among the attacking columns. but the intelligence Scott provided was accurate and detailed. The failure was in execution, not in the information. And the episode established a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Enslaved people providing precise, first-hand intelligence that was superior to anything else available. Butler, to his credit, recognized the value of what he had stumbled onto. He issued standing orders that all contraband arriving at Fort Monroe be brought to his headquarters for debriefing. This was the birth of systematic black intelligence in the Civil War, and it happened not because some brilliant strategist in Washington conceived the idea, but because a single escaped slave showed up at the gate of a Union fort with information that no one else had thought to ask for. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Enslaved laborers who escaped or were captured provided Union forces with detailed, accurate, first-hand intelligence about Confederate military infrastructure that no other source could match. A cavalry scout observing from a distance might estimate the number of guns at a position. An enslaved worker who had placed those guns could tell you the exact number, the caliber, the condition, and the ammunition supply. The difference in intelligence quality was enormous, and Union commanders who recognized it had a decisive advantage over those who didn't. Let's spend some time inside a contraband camp, because these places were where the raw material of black intelligence was first processed, and the experience of arriving in one was itself a story of desperation and hope. By 1862, contraband camps had sprung up behind Union lines across the South. They were crowded, unsanitary, and under-resourced, but they were free. Thousands of enslaved people had risked everything to reach them, walking for days through hostile territory, wading through swamps, dodging Confederate patrols, traveling at night and hiding during the day. Some arrived alone. Some arrived in groups of 20 or 30. Some carried children on their backs. Some had been shot at during their escape and arrived with wounds that needed treatment before they could be debriefed. The debriefing process was rarely formal. A Union officer, often an aide-de-camp or an intelligence officer attached to the commanding general's staff, would sit down with the new arrival and ask questions. Where did you come from? What plantation? How many Confederate soldiers did you see? What were they doing? Where were they camped? What fortifications were there? What weapons? What was the condition of the roads? What about supplies? What was the mood of the soldiers? The answers were extraordinary in their detail. Enslaved people who had worked as cooks in Confederate camps could describe the size and composition of the force based on the number of meals they prepared. Those who had driven supply wagons could describe the routes, the condition of the roads, and the contents of the wagons. Those who had worked on fortifications could provide dimensions, descriptions, and sometimes even rough drawings of the positions. Those who had served as body servants to Confederate officers could report on conversations they'd overheard, morale assessments, and sometimes even details of planned operations. The intelligence officers quickly learned to ask specific, directed questions. Not just, what did you see? But how many wagons in the supply train? And which direction were they moving? And what regiment was camped at the crossroads? The specificity of the questions improved over the course of the war, as Union officers developed experience debriefing black informants and learned how to extract the maximum intelligence value from their observations. And here's something crucial. The information flow wasn't one-directional. Enslaved people arriving in Union lines didn't just passively answer questions. They actively volunteered information, sometimes insisting on the importance of specific details that the debriefing officer might have overlooked. A man who had been forced to place torpedoes in a river didn't wait to be asked about them. He told the officer immediately because he understood the military significance of what he knew. A woman who had overheard a conversation about troop movements didn't need to be prompted. She had been mentally cataloguing the information since the moment she heard it, preparing to deliver it to someone who could use it. This active engagement with the intelligence process reflects something important about the motivations of black informants. They weren't passive sources being milked for information. They were active participants in their own liberation. They understood, often better than the Union officers they were talking to, the strategic implications of what they knew, and they were eager to contribute, because every piece of intelligence that damaged the Confederacy brought the end of slavery closer. Now let's talk about a spy whose name appears in the records only briefly, but whose story illuminates the clandestine world of black espionage. His name was John Scobell, and he worked for Alan Pinkerton's intelligence operation in the early years of the war. Scobell was a formerly enslaved man from Mississippi, educated by his Scottish enslaver and fluent enough to pass in multiple social contexts. Pinkerton recruited him in 1861 and used him on missions behind Confederate lines, sometimes paired with white agents, sometimes working alone. Scobell's cover stories varied. He posed as a laborer, a cook, a vendor. In each role, he moved through Confederate territory gathering intelligence that he transmitted back to Pinkerton's network. What made Scobell particularly effective was his ability to tap into the existing communication networks of the enslaved community. When he entered a new area, he could connect with local enslaved people through churches, market days, and the informal social networks that slavery had made necessary. These connections gave him access to information that no white spy could have obtained, because enslaved people who would never trust a white stranger would talk to a black man who spoke their language, shared their experience, and was clearly working toward the same goal. Scobell's work illustrates a crucial point about black espionage in the Civil War. It didn't operate in isolation. It was embedded in and drew strength from the existing social infrastructure of the black community. The same networks of communication, trust, and mutual aid that had sustained enslaved communities for generations became, during the war, the backbone of an intelligence system that the Confederacy never saw coming. Let's talk about the churches, because they were the nerve centers of the black intelligence network in ways that haven't been fully appreciated. Throughout the South, black churches, both the official ones that slaveholders sometimes permitted, and the secret hush harbors where enslaved people worshipped out of earshot, served as nodes in the communication network. They were places where people from different plantations could meet, exchange information, and coordinate actions without arousing suspicion. A Sunday service brought together enslaved people from across a wide geographic area, and the social interactions around the service provided cover for the exchange of intelligence. During the war, these church networks became channels for military information. A preacher who traveled between communities could carry intelligence along with his sermons. A choir leader who visited other congregations could transmit messages embedded in the selection of hymns. The same coded communication systems that enslaved people had used for generations. The double meanings in spirituals, the secret signals embedded in everyday objects and actions, were now applied to the transmission of military intelligence. The Confederacy never penetrated these networks because it never recognized their existence. To white Southerners, black church services were at best a harmless diversion, and at worst, a source of potential unrest that needed monitoring. The idea that these gatherings were functioning as intelligence nodes within a sophisticated espionage network was simply beyond the Confederacy's conceptual framework. Once again, the assumption of black simplicity was the spy's greatest protection. Now let's talk about the daily reality of being a spy when you're also someone's property, because the mechanics of the double life deserve more attention than they usually get. You wake before dawn, as always. Your body belongs to the slaveholder until dark. You cook his food, you clean his house, you tend his garden, you serve his guests, and through all of it, you are listening, you are watching, you are cataloging every piece of information that crosses your awareness. The general who visits for lunch mentions that reinforcements are expected from Vicksburg. You note it. The colonel's wife mentions in passing that her husband's regiment is moving south tomorrow. You note it. A dispatch rider arrives looking exhausted and anxious. You note the time, the direction he came from, the urgency of his reception. None of this is written down. You can't risk paper. Everything lives in your memory, organized, prioritized, and ready for transmission. The transmission is the dangerous part. You have to find a moment, a gap in the surveillance, a plausible excuse for being somewhere you shouldn't be. And you have to connect with someone in the network. Maybe it's the market woman who comes on Wednesdays. You buy something from her, and in the exchange of coins and produce, information passes in a whispered sentence. Maybe it's the contraband who has been hiding in the woods for 3 days, waiting for a chance to cross the lines. You bring him food and information at the same time, and he carries both to freedom. Maybe you have a contact at the next plantation, and you use your Sunday visiting privilege to walk 3 miles and deliver the intelligence in person, disguised as a social call. Every method carries risk. Every method requires improvisation. Every method depends on a network of people who trust each other absolutely, because a single betrayal would unravel the entire operation. And you maintain this for months, years, the length of the war, with no training, no support, no handler, no extraction plan, and no guarantee that anyone will ever know what you did or thank you for it. The psychological weight of this existence is staggering. You are performing 2 identities simultaneously. The visible identity, the obedient, dull, unthreatening servant that the slaveholder expects to see, requires constant attention and energy to maintain. The hidden identity, the spy, the agent, the person with a mission and a purpose, requires a different kind of energy, sharper and more focused, but also more dangerous. The 2 identities can never overlap. A moment of carelessness, a flash of the wrong expression, a question that reveals too much understanding, and the hidden identity devours the visible one, and both of you are destroyed. Modern espionage literature is full of accounts of the psychological toll of long-term undercover work. Double agents who develop anxiety disorders. Deep cover operatives who lose track of which identity is real. Intelligence officers who burn out from the constant stress of maintaining a false persona. These are trained professionals with institutional support systems. Now imagine the same psychological burden carried by an untrained enslaved person with no support system at all, operating under conditions where exposure means not just the end of the mission, but the end of your life, and potentially the lives of everyone you love. The fact that so many black spies maintained their cover for months and years without exposure is a testament to psychological resilience that borders on the superhuman. And the fact that they did so without recognition, without compensation, and without even the comfort of knowing that their sacrifice would be acknowledged, adds a layer of moral weight to their achievement that is difficult to fully articulate. Let's talk about the water, because rivers were the highways of the Civil War, and black Americans who knew those rivers were invaluable. Robert Smalls is the most famous example, but he was far from alone. Enslaved boatmen, pilots, and fishermen possessed intimate knowledge of the South's coastal and riverine geography. They knew the channels, the shoals, the currents, the tides. They knew where torpedoes had been planted because they had often placed them under Confederate orders. They knew which waterways were navigable and which were obstructed. They knew how the depth changed with the season, which sandbars shifted after storms, where the underwater obstructions lurked that could tear the bottom out of a ship. This knowledge was critical for Union naval operations along the southern coast, and it was available almost exclusively through black informants. The Union Navy in the Civil War faced a fundamental problem. It was fighting in waters it didn't know. The coastline of the Confederacy stretched for thousands of miles, from Virginia to Texas, encompassing hundreds of rivers, sounds, inlets, and harbors that no northern sailor had ever navigated. Charts were incomplete or inaccurate. Local knowledge was essential, and local knowledge resided almost exclusively in the minds of the Black Americans who had spent their lives on these waters. Enslaved fishermen knew the Chesapeake Bay, the Carolina Sounds, the Georgia coast, and the Gulf of Mexico with an intimacy that came from daily immersion. They knew where the fish ran and where the oysters grew, but they also knew the tides, the channels, the shoals, and the hazards. Enslaved, pilots like Smalls had been steering ships through fortified harbors for years, learning the signal systems, the mine placements, and the defensive architectures that the Confederacy depended on for coastal defense. When these men reached Union lines, they brought with them navigational intelligence that was, in many cases, superior to anything the Union Navy possessed. Tubman's Combahee River raid is the most dramatic example of river intelligence in action. Her scouts had identified the locations of Confederate mines by finding the enslaved men who had planted them. Those men traded the mines' locations for the promise of freedom, a transaction that captures the entire dynamic of black intelligence in a single exchange. The Confederacy forced enslaved people to place its defenses, and then those same people traded the locations of those defenses for the one thing the Confederacy was fighting to deny them: freedom for information. Information for freedom. The equation was simple and devastating. But the river intelligence went beyond individual operations. Black pilots and boatmen served throughout the Union Navy, guiding ships through waters they had navigated for years. Their knowledge of local conditions, from the depth of channels to the behavior of tides to the location of submerged obstacles, was irreplaceable. Without them, Union naval operations along the southern coast would have been far more costly, far more dangerous, and far less effective. The Union Navy in the South was, in significant part, navigated by Black Americans who had been forced to learn these waters as part of their enslavement, and who now used that knowledge against the system that had enslaved them. And the river knowledge served a purpose beyond naval operations. Rivers were the primary escape routes for enslaved people fleeing to Union lines. The same knowledge of waterways that made black pilots valuable to the Navy also made them invaluable as guides for escape parties. They knew which rivers to follow, where to cross, where the current was gentle enough for wading, and where it was too dangerous. They knew which banks were patrolled and which were unguarded. They knew the secret landings, the hidden coves, the places where a boat could be beached without being seen. This knowledge, accumulated over generations of living and working on the water, was the geographical foundation of both the intelligence network and the liberation network, and the two were, in practice, impossible to separate. Let's talk about the women, because women were disproportionately represented among black spies, and the reasons illuminate both the nature of the espionage and the structure of the society it operated within. Women, particularly enslaved women, working in domestic roles, had the most intimate access to the private spaces where sensitive information was discussed. The cook, who prepared meals for Confederate officers, was in the room when they talked strategy over dinner. She heard the frustration in a colonel's voice when he complained about supply shortages. She heard the excitement when a general discussed an upcoming offensive. She heard the fear when officers spoke in hushed tones about Union advances. And she heard all of it while standing at the hearth, stirring a pot, her back to the room, her presence so thoroughly part of the furniture that the officers forgot she had ears. The maid who cleaned the general's office had access to the papers on his desk. She didn't need to steal them. She just needed to read them while dusting the furniture, a task that put her hands and her eyes within inches of documents marked confidential. The laundress who handled the officers' clothing could count uniforms and estimate troop numbers. Every uniform she washed was a data point. A sudden increase in laundry meant reinforcements had arrived. A decrease meant the unit had suffered casualties or been redeployed. She was conducting a census of the enemy's strength through the simple act of doing their washing. The nurse who tended wounded soldiers heard their unguarded conversations. Men in pain, men frightened, men delirious with fever, spoke freely about things that healthy men in their right minds would have kept to themselves. They talked about their units, their officers, their positions, their morale. They talked about what they'd seen and what they feared was coming. And the nurse, applying bandages and offering water, absorbed every word. Women's domestic roles placed them at the intersection of privacy and information in ways that men's roles, more often outdoors and more closely supervised, did not. A man working in a field was under the overseer's eye. A woman working in a house was under no one's eye, because the work of cleaning and cooking and nursing was so thoroughly invisible to the men who benefited from it that they didn't bother to watch. The Confederate officer, who would never discuss strategy in front of an enslaved man, would discuss it freely in front of an enslaved woman, because in his mind, the woman wasn't really there. She was part of the scenery. Scenery doesn't listen. Furthermore, women were even less likely to be suspected of espionage than men. The intersection of racial and gender assumptions created a double layer of invisibility. A black woman working as a domestic servant was so far beneath the notice of Confederate officers that the idea of her as an intelligence threat was literally inconceivable. This made women both the most effective and the safest category of black spy. Though safe is a relative term when the baseline is constant danger. The women who conducted espionage also faced unique risks that male spies did not. An enslaved woman caught in compromising circumstances had no legal protection against sexual violence. The power dynamic between enslaved women and the white men who controlled them was already fraught with the constant threat of assault, and a woman suspected of espionage would have been even more vulnerable. The courage required for women to engage in intelligence work must be understood in this context. They risked not only death, but a spectrum of gendered violence that makes their willingness to serve all the more remarkable. Mary Richards in the Confederate White House. Mary Lou Vester walking stolen documents across enemy lines. Harriet Tubman running a spy network and leading a military raid. These women operated in the most dangerous possible circumstances with a combination of courage and competence that would be extraordinary in any context and is almost miraculous given the context of their times. They were doing work that would earn modern intelligence operatives commendations, promotions, and lifelong pensions. They received none of those things. What they received was the knowledge that their work mattered, and for most of them, even that knowledge was buried for more than a century. Let's talk about something that connects the espionage of the Civil War to the broader history of black resistance in America, because black spying didn't appear from nowhere. It was the wartime expression of a resistance tradition that had been developing for centuries. The same skills that made black Americans effective spies had been practiced in other forms of resistance long before the first shots at Fort Sumter. The Underground Railroad was, in many ways, an intelligence operation. It required the same skills: covert communication, network management, identity concealment, risk assessment, route planning, and the ability to operate under constant surveillance. Harriet Tubman's seamless transition from Underground Railroad conductor to military spy was not a coincidence. She was applying the same tradecraft to a different theater of operations. The coded spirituals that enslaved people used to communicate escape plans were a form of signals intelligence. Wade in the Water wasn't just a hymn about baptism. It was an operational instruction to use waterways to throw off the scent of tracking dogs. Follow the drinking gourd contained navigational information pointing to the North Star. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot signaled that a rescue operation was coming. These songs were intelligence communications hidden in plain sight, transmitted openly in the presence of white audiences who heard only music. The same principle, hiding information in forms that the enemy couldn't recognize as information, was applied to Civil War espionage. The grapevine, the informal communication network that carried news through enslaved communities with astonishing speed and accuracy, was a pre-existing intelligence infrastructure that the war simply repurposed. Before the war, the grapevine carried news of sales, escapes, births, deaths, and the movements of slaveholders. During the war, it carried military intelligence. The network didn't need to be built from scratch. It already existed. The war just gave it a new category of information to transmit. Even the performance of ignorance, the mask that black spies wore in the presence of white Confederates, was a refinement of the survival strategy that every enslaved person had practiced since childhood. The ability to appear harmless while being dangerous, to seem stupid while being brilliant, to perform submission while plotting resistance, was the foundational skill of both survival in slavery and espionage in wartime. The Civil War didn't create black spies. Slavery did. The war simply provided the occasion for skills that had been developing for 2.5 centuries to be applied to their most consequential purpose. Now let's talk about what all of this meant for the outcome of the war, because the strategic impact of black intelligence is difficult to overstate. Union generals who utilized black intelligence sources consistently performed better than those who ignored or dismissed them. The information provided by black Americans wasn't peripheral to Union military operations. It was central. It shaped battle plans. It guided troop movements. It identified Confederate vulnerabilities. It provided the kind of detailed, first-hand, accurate intelligence that no other source could replicate. And as the war progressed, the volume and quality of black intelligence increased because more enslaved people were escaping to Union lines, more territories were being occupied, and more opportunities for intelligence gathering were opening up. Consider the cumulative effect. Thousands of contraband debriefings, each providing a piece of the puzzle. Agents in place within the Confederate government and military. Spy networks operating behind enemy lines. Enslaved workers reporting on fortifications they had built with their own hands. Boatmen guiding Union ships through hostile waters. Women reporting conversations from inside Confederate households. The aggregate of all this intelligence was an information advantage that grew more pronounced as the war continued. By the last 2 years of the conflict, Union intelligence was dramatically superior to Confederate intelligence, and Black Americans were a primary reason why. The Confederacy, blinded by its own racial ideology, never developed effective countermeasures. Confederate officers complained about the leakage of information, but consistently attributed it to white Union sympathizers rather than to the enslaved people who surrounded them. They launched counterintelligence investigations that focused on suspected white dissenters and peace society members while completely ignoring the intelligence network operating in their own households, their own camps, their own military installations. It was as though a man whose house was being robbed every night spent all his time watching the front door while the thieves climbed in through a window he refused to believe existed. General Patrick Cleburne's warning about the omnipresent spy system went largely unheeded. Cleburne was one of the very few Confederate officers who understood the scale of the problem, and his proposed solution was radical. Arm and free enslaved people to fight for the Confederacy, eliminating both the intelligence vulnerability and the manpower shortage in a single stroke. The proposal was suppressed by Confederate leadership, who understood that accepting it would mean admitting that the entire ideological foundation of the Confederacy, the claim that black people were fit only for servitude, was false. Cleburne was told never to raise the subject again, and the proposal nearly cost him his career. He was killed at the Battle of Franklin in November 1864, and his insight about the spy system died with him, unheeded and unacted upon. The Confederacy couldn't fix the intelligence problem because fixing it would have required dismantling the racial hierarchy that was the Confederacy's reason for existing. You can't simultaneously maintain a system of total racial domination and also guard your secrets from the people you dominate. The contradiction was structural, permanent, and ultimately fatal. In this sense, the Confederacy was defeated, in part, by its own racism. The belief that black people were incapable of sophisticated thought was simultaneously the Confederacy's central ideology and its greatest strategic vulnerability. It built a nation on the idea that 4 million people were subhuman, and then it was undone by the demonstrated humanity, intelligence, and courage of those same 4 million people. The poetic justice is almost too perfect. The system designed to deny black agency was brought down, in significant measure, by the exercise of black agency at its most skilled and consequential. Let's come back to you, lying in the darkness of a Richmond bedroom, listening to the sounds of the Confederate capital settling into sleep. You've spent the day serving meals, cleaning rooms, and absorbing every word spoken in your presence. You've memorized the details of a conversation between two Confederate generals about the movement of troops toward the Shenandoah Valley. You've noted the arrival of a dispatch rider and the urgency with which his message was received. You've observed the mood of the household, the anxiety that signals bad news from the front, the false confidence that suggests a pending offensive. Tomorrow, you'll find a way to pass this information along. Maybe through a market woman who carries messages in a basket of eggs. Maybe through a contact in Elizabeth Van Loo's network who will encode it and send it north. Maybe through a contraband who is planning to cross the lines tomorrow night. The method will vary. The risk will not. Every transmission is a gamble with your life as the stake. But you'll do it. You'll do it because you know, with a certainty that goes deeper than strategy or ideology, that every piece of information you transmit brings the end of slavery closer. You're not fighting for a flag or a government or an abstract principle. You're fighting for your own freedom and for the freedom of everyone who looks like you. And you're fighting with the only weapons available to you: your eyes, your ears, your memory, and the mask you wear so perfectly. that the most powerful men in the Confederacy have no idea they're being watched. So tonight, as you let the quiet settle around you, think about what you've walked through. You've stood in the pre-dawn darkness of Charleston Harbor with Robert Smalls, your hands on the wheel of a stolen ship, your family hidden below deck, your heart hammering as you gave the signal that would either deliver you to freedom or get you killed. You've sat in the Confederate White House with Mary Richards, invisible and indispensable, cataloging secrets that no white spy could have accessed. You've navigated a mined river with Harriet Tubman, watching 750 people run toward the gunboats and toward freedom, their feet splashing through the shallows, their children held above the water, their faces lit with something that looks like disbelief and joy and terror all at once. You've walked across enemy lines with Mary Lou Vestra, stolen documents sewn into your clothing, too stubborn to let anyone dismiss what you carried. You've established a spy network in hostile territory with Abraham Galloway, risking execution every day because the alternative was a world where your people remained in chains. You've sat in a contraband camp with George Scott, drawing diagrams of fortifications in the dirt for a Union officer who is only now, slowly, beginning to understand just how much the people he dismissively calls contrabands actually know about the war he's trying to win. These people deserve more than our admiration. They deserve the recognition that history denied them. They were among the most effective intelligence operatives in American military history, and they conducted their work without training, without institutional support, without pay, and without the most basic protection that any nation owes to those who risk their lives in its service. They did it because they had to, because no one else could, and because the stakes, their own freedom and the freedom of 4 million people, were too high to justify doing anything less. The CIA's own historical analysis calls black dispatches the most prolific and productive intelligence source of the entire Civil War. Let that settle over you for a moment. The most effective spy network in one of the largest military conflicts of the 19th century was operated by people who were legally classified as property. People who couldn't vote, couldn't testify in court, couldn't legally learn to read. People whose intelligence, the very quality that made them such effective spies, was categorically denied by the society they were spying on. If that isn't one of the greatest ironies in the history of warfare, I don't know what is. And here's what makes the story even more remarkable. They did this not for glory, not for pay, not for recognition, not for a place in the history books that would, in any case, refuse to include them for more than a century. They did it because they understood, with a clarity that transcended strategy or ideology, that every piece of intelligence they gathered, every message they carried, every risk they took, brought the end of slavery closer. They were fighting the war within the war. The official war was fought on battlefields with armies and artillery. Their war was fought in kitchens and parlors and on rivers and roads, with nothing but their minds and their courage and the mask they wore so perfectly that the enemy never knew it was a mask at all. And when the war ended, when the last Confederate flag was lowered and the last enslaved person was freed, the spies went home. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't give interviews. They didn't petition for medals or pensions, at least not at first. They simply returned to the work of building lives in a world that was finally, tentatively, grudgingly free. They had done their part. They had risked everything. And they asked for nothing in return except the freedom that their sacrifice had helped secure. Some of them, like Smalls, went on to extraordinary public careers, serving in Congress and fighting for the rights they had helped win on the battlefield. Some of them, like Tubman, spent decades petitioning for the pension they deserved, waiting for a government that owed them everything to acknowledge what they had done. Some of them, like Mary Richards, lived in poverty, their contributions unknown, their names forgotten, their sacrifice buried under layers of indifference and prejudice. And some of them, the vast, unnamed majority, simply disappeared into the fabric of free black life, carrying their secrets with them to the grave. They told no one what they had done. They let the stories fade. They raised their children and worked their land and built their communities. And the extraordinary things they had done during the war became private memories, whispered to grandchildren perhaps, or simply held in silence, a personal knowledge too precious and too dangerous to share. But the truth doesn't require acknowledgement to be true. What they did, they did. The intelligence they gathered shaped battles that shaped the war that shaped the nation. The risks they took were real. The courage they showed was real. The contribution they made to the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery was real. And if the record of that contribution was destroyed by Confederate bonfires and Union carelessness and a century of racial prejudice, the contribution itself endures in the outcome it produced. A nation that survived its greatest crisis, in part because the people it had enslaved refused to accept that enslavement as permanent. So tonight, as you close your eyes, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the spies whose names we'll never know, the cooks who memorized battle plans while serving dinner, the servants who carried secrets in the soles of their shoes, the boatmen who guided Union ships through waters they'd been forced to learn under bondage, the mothers who risked not just their own lives, but their children's lives, because they believed that freedom was worth any risk, the men and women who wore the mask so perfectly that the most powerful people in the Confederacy never knew they were being watched, and who then removed that mask in the privacy of their own hearts and knew exactly who they were and exactly what they were fighting for. They proved that the most powerful weapon in any war isn't a cannon or a rifle or an army. It's the human mind. And they proved that the human minds that the Confederacy dismissed as incapable of thought were, in fact, the minds that helped bring the Confederacy down. They proved that you cannot build a nation on the denial of human intelligence and then expect to win a war that depends on intelligence. They proved that the people you refuse to see are the people most dangerous to you. And they proved, with their lives and their sacrifice and their quiet, magnificent courage, that freedom is not given, it is taken, by people brave enough to reach for it, smart enough to plan for it, and stubborn enough to fight for it with whatever weapons they have, even when the only weapons available are a sharp pair of ears, a good memory, and the fierce, unbreakable determination to be free. The war is over now. The spies have come in from the cold. The masks have been removed, and the people who wore them, the people who risked everything, who sacrificed everything, who won a war from inside the house of the enemy, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes or curiosities, but as what they were: heroes, unsung, unpaid, unrecognized heroes whose courage helped determine the fate of a nation, and whose legacy endures in the freedom that their intelligence helped to secure. Rest now, sleep deeply, and may your dreams carry the quiet strength of people who changed history not with armies, but with attention, not with weapons, but with wit, and not with power, but with the one thing that no slaveholder, no confederacy, no system of oppression could ever control: the fierce, defiant, unbreakable intelligence of the human spirit. Good night.